All right. Good morning, everybody. Happy Thursday. Almost made it through another week here. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar, Top Reports for Cloud Migration, What You Need and Why. My name is Kevin Sweeney, and I'm a Customer Success Manager here at Variphy. Today, I have the absolute pleasure of being joined by our Director of Systems Engineering, Victor Verba. Victor, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Kevin. I'm doing good. The weather's a little cold and we got a little bit of snow for the first time of this year, but we're doing all right.
Absolutely. Well, we're definitely excited to have your expertise here today. So as a quick reminder, this webinar is being recorded. So if you have to leave early, we'll send you a link to the recording. You can also visit our webinars page at variphy.com/webinars to watch any of our previous webinars once they have been posted. If you do have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat panel. Good questions always make for a more engaging webinar, so please don't hesitate to use that, and we'll try to answer those as they come in. Okay, so just a quick agenda for today. We'll start off with a brief overview of Variphy, and then we'll be discussing some of the top reports you need to be running, no matter what point of your transition you're in. After that, we'll pause and finish answering any last questions that we may have missed. And then finally, we're going to reward 3 lucky attendees an Amazon gift card. So hang around for that to see if you've won. If you're not familiar with Variphy, we specialize in analytics and management solutions for UC platforms like Cisco, WebEx Calling, Microsoft Teams, and Zoom Phone, along with a host of other Cisco Call Manager related tools like remote phone control, change management, DNDID management, and more. We also offer a migration assessment. So if you're in the process of moving to cloud calling, or just thinking about moving, we can really help you get the data you need to make your migration as easy as possible. And that's kind of a good segue to kick things off, because a lot of that data is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Like obviously there's a pretty big push to cloud calling platforms these days. We've covered it quite a bit in the past, from everything like cost savings, being able to cut back on manpower since it can be a little bit easier to manage. They're flexible, their ability to scale up and down pretty quickly based on organizational needs. And then, some of the added bonuses of, extra security and compliance features as well. So kicking things off here, Vic, we definitely won't have time to go over every report that people should probably be running, but we've went through and kind of selected some that, I recognize that are important. And I just kind of want to hear your expertise. How are you guys using these in the field, and why are they so important for the folks your team is helping to migrate? So we'll get right into it with number 1. We've got hunt group and call queue utilization reports. So obviously these are pretty critical for managing call flows and kind of pinpointing inefficient queues. So how are you guys using these reports as it relates to migration, Vic?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kevin. A lot of what we're seeing folks trying to do is really get a handle on their existing environments. And hunt groups and call queues are, one of those things that are in existing environments. People are really trying to decide whether, what is the right migration strategy. Do I need to move some of these to a contact center? If you're going the WebEx route, is Essentials sufficient for what we're doing now? What we're seeing is people really trying to understand and make migration plans and understand what that licensing is going to look like as they're moving over to their new platform, and what the best plan is to move to the new platform. So being able to use something like a hunt group report out of Variphy, you're going to be able to identify, the busyness of your hunt groups, how many calls are coming in, how busy your agents are, things like abandonment rates, all of those things kind of help decide whether you want to migrate to maybe something like a contact center, or vice versa. We see people with contact centers deciding, do they really still need those? So when you're running something like a hunt group report in an existing system, you're going to get to see how busy are they. And, are they able to handle the bulk of their calls, or are they looking at abandonment rates at, somewhere in the 20 to 30 to 40%? And if that's the case, maybe a hunt group is not going to be sufficient for what they need. Maybe they need something a little bit more, something that's going to have more queuing and more options to be able to choose from. So they're using our reports to help guide some of those decisions. But not just that, but they're also using those reports to help guide some of their migration plan. In other words, not just, what feature are we going to need to migrate to, but also who should we start with? I don't want to, say, hey, what, we think this hunt group has the least amount of volume and is the best option for our migration plan, or, to start with our migration. You want hard data to make those decisions. You don't want to go off of, we're pretty sure this is the right one. So by looking at the numbers that we're able to provide in the single report, and this hunt group report is a perfect example, is we can outline all the hunt groups that you have in your environment, identify from top down which ones are the busiest, what are the answer rates, abandonment rates, and you can actually make real data-driven decisions on your migration plan. In other words, how you want to start that plan, but also what maybe you want to do, whether you want to go towards a contact center, or maybe you need to take some of these hunt groups or call queues that you have in your Cisco call manager and move them over to a call queue in a different platform, or an essentials in a different platform. So we're really helping drive a lot of those data decisions by looking at the numbers, not just what we have programmed in the phone system.
Okay. So definitely a pretty essential pre-migration report for
Yes.
this one. Then.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Up next, dormant phone reports. I feel this is probably pretty straightforward. Any dormant devices are not really only just a wasted resource, but can probably complicate migrations the more of them you have.
Yeah. I'll honestly, this is probably one of the number one reports people are running. It's great to talk, to look in your call manager and see what you got programmed. And we'll talk a little bit about that, later on when we start to talk about as-built and things like that. But what you have programmed isn't what you're going to be using. We go into, and, folks out on this call with us, you go into an environment that's been running for 15 or 20 years. It's changed hands through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different administrators. You got multiple hands in the cookie jar. What's actually still being used is the big question. So it's not necessarily about what's programmed. It's about, what do I actually need to migrate? So you can go into an environment on really any given day, and there's probably not an environment that I've run into that can't utilize this. Take a look at all of the phones in their phone system. And this particular report's going to identify the ones that haven't been used based on a threshold. That may be, maybe anything that hasn't been used in 6 months. Let's cut out of our migration plan. We haven't used it in 6 months. Do we really need to spend the money migrating that? Do we really need to move that over to our new environment? Or let's say it hasn't been used in 6 months. Now we got a reason to actually look and what is this? Why is it even in there? So this report is really driving a lot of decisions on what should go into the new environment. It's kind of like, you don't want to move the garbage to your new house. Well, when you're migrating, I like to look at it as you're getting a new house. You've got a clean floor plan. You can put new things in it, or you could take all the old stuff and just put it back in. Well, a lot of times that old stuff, it's a good time to clean the house before you actually move it. So that's exactly what this report is doing, is it's identifying all of the phones that just have had no usage over your threshold, letting you know that, hey, you know what, you can eliminate a whole lot of garbage, save yourself a lot of money by not moving things over that you don't really need.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm assuming just kind of the larger the environment, the more valuable these reports are probably going to be.
Yeah, to an extent, obviously, the larger the environment, the more hands in the cookie jar you've had. But even we see with the small to mid-range sizes that, when those call managers have changed hands year over year, things just don't get cleaned up. So even with small to mid-range, they're really able to take advantage of this and say, okay, you know what, we need a heck of a lot licensed than we thought, when we were just comparing how our call manager was configured to actually how our call manager is being used. And that's the key thing. We can all look at configurations, but what we're going to really focus in on is the actual usage and give you a leg up to be able to say, okay, great, it's configured that way, but do we need it? Is it being used? And that's spot on. So really, any size customer is utilizing this, but you're right. The largest customers really see the most impact.
All right. Moving on. Underutilized users report.
This is another big one. So, previously we talked about dormancy and phones that haven't had any usage. But it's not always the phones that just haven't had usage that we want to focus in on. A lot of times we also want to focus in on those phones that are floating around out there, but do we really need them? Those hallway phones, those lunchroom phones, those phones that are sitting in servers' rooms, those fax machines that haven't placed a fax in 2 years, or maybe they've placed a couple of faxes, but are those lines, are those devices, are those phones that we really need to migrate over to our new system? Again, it's all about just really making sure that when you move to that new house is clean and tidy, and you're not bringing the stuff that you don't really need. So the nice thing about this, as opposed to the dormancy, is I can look through here and say, out of a year, show me all of the users maybe that haven't had a call, haven't had less than 20 calls or 50 calls in a year. Do I really need to pay for a license for those users? Same thing with phones. Show me all of the phones that haven't had a call or have had 20 calls or less than 20 calls in the last 6 months or a year. Are those things I want to pay for and bring into my new environment? Are those potentially phones that I might have to purchase because they're not cloud capable? And is it really worth it for me to be able to do that when they've had very low call volume over a certain threshold? So this is a great report to, again, still help tighten up your new environment and not take things that you don't necessarily need. I won't say garbage, because these phones may have gotten used once or twice in the last 6 months. But do they really need to go into your new environment? Does that phone sitting in the server room really serve a purpose and have that much value that it needs to be able to, stay there and carry over to my new environment?
Okay, so highlighting some of those common area phones that you might not need. Keeping things moving. Unity and call handler reports.
Yeah, so this guy is important. So, what we see, and again, going back to, we've had this phone system out there. We've added all kinds of things to it. Department A wanted some new options in their call handler. The Department A manager is no longer there. Nobody's using the option, but how do you know they're not using the options? So, when you're looking at somebody's environment, you really want to get an understanding of that usage, especially with Unity. Migrating these messaging systems over to new platforms can be extremely time consuming, especially depending on how they have that messaging system configured. So one of the things we see is a lot of people trying to understand how that messaging is being used. In other words, and this is a great example with this report, is we can see, we've got operators as our number one option in this report. Well, okay, 9 times out of 10, when you get into a messaging system, and this is a loose example, you listen to the first option. I'm telling you, if the first option says talk to an operator, I'm pressing that first. I'm not even listening to the rest of the options. So helping understand how some of these options are being utilized helps you decide how you should be configuring your new environment. I'm moving option 1 and operators down to option 9. I want them to hear the rest of the menus, because maybe more calls are going to rentals, but we only see 9 because it's option 3. So everybody just hits option 1 for operators. So really getting an idea of what your current Unity messaging system is doing using the CDR analytics to understand how those options are being used when they're coming out of your Unity messaging system really helps people design a much better structure in their new system, and really guide your end users and your customers through your tree to make the right decisions, not just the first decision that sounds okay. So, this report is great at helping people understand what's currently being used and understanding what they want to bring over. Rentals here, that number 3 option, it may be a perfect option. Maybe that is 9 calls in several months, 4 months. Do we need it? Do we really need to migrate all the rentals and the submenus and all the things that go along with it over to my new system if it only handles 9 calls in a 4-month period? So, it helps you make better decisions in your new environment. Again, keeping your house nice and clean when you're getting ready to move in.
How often are you seeing companies kind of overcomplicate, things like their auto attendants or IVRs?
All the time. All the time. And it is. And it's because there's so many different hands in the cookie jar. Everybody wants something else. And, somebody gets a request to make a change within the messaging system. Well, that gets done. A huge example that we see all the time, and I hate to punt back to it, is the COVID area. the COVID era, I'll call it, back, 2020, 2021, when COVID first started hitting and the world was kind of shutting down, is people were changing all of these things. People were changing hunt groups. They were changing all their call handlers to handle different messaging, especially when we start to talk about healthcare. Thing is, as that tapered off, nobody went back and cleaned that stuff up. So it's still floating around in those messaging systems. Now we have people going in, like our partners and things, getting ready to cut over to new environments. And they're like, okay, well, now we have all these options. You just take it one-to-one relationship and you just move it over from from A to B. But again, all those options aren't being used anymore, or they're not being used like they originally were. So now is the time to be able to look at a report like this and make a decision on, what, do we really need this, or can we do some combining here and some consolidating of some of these options?
Got it. All right. Keep things moving. Capacity utilization, obviously, paying for unused capacity is probably pretty common, whether you're migrating or not, but how are you guys using these, Vic?
Yeah, you got it. Spot on. Paying for unused capacity, or realizing that, you are underutilized or overutilized on your capacity. So, you're moving off of a carrier who's got some type of capacity associated to it. Most people think of capacity as it's your SIP gateway, it's your PRIs, but it's extremely pertinent when you're moving over to your new location, because you may be getting new carriers, you may be trying to cut over to the same carrier, but do you need as much capacity now as you did maybe 3 years ago or 5 years ago when you first signed on to that carrier? Do you need more capacity now because your system has grown? Or maybe throughout the multiple years of your environment, you've forked off data, you're doing different things, you have multiple carriers now, you've acquired different companies. So as you're getting ready to move over to your new environment, it is really important to understand that all those different carriers that you may have, it's all going to go into maybe one spot now. So understanding what that will look like as you combine, let's say, an AT&T and a Sprint line together, what does that look like from a total capacity as I move to my new environment? So extremely important to understand how many concurrent calls are going on in your existing environment, how many channels are being utilized, because that's going to directly relate to what you're purchasing in your new environment, or at least what you're migrating over. Whether that's under and you realize, hey, you know what, we're getting real close to our capacity, or whether it's way, you're spec'd way over and you've got a capacity for 500 calls, but you can see in the last year, you've peaked out at 200 at most. Do you really need more than double your existing capacity? So yeah, these are huge when you're making your migration, because they're big money savers and big time savers. And really it's going to help you prevent, one, dropped calls and mistakes by not getting enough capacity, but also save a lot of money by making sure that you're right sizing in your new environment, as opposed to relying on what your data was 5 years ago when you first, did your exercises.
All right. Concurrent call volume reports. How is call activity? How are you guys using that, to help migrations?
Yeah, so much like capacity utilization, the thing is about capacity utilization, people hear it and they think it's SIP, it's SIP trunks, it's PRIs, it's my T1s. But capacity utilization for us goes beyond just looking at your gateways. Capacity utilization goes into, all right, what's the capacity of my hunt groups? In the previous slide, we talked about hunt groups and we talked about abandonment percentages. Well, I can counter that report with a concurrent call volume report for my hunt group or my agents or my operators and say, yeah, you know what? We've got 10 operators, and 12 times throughout the day, all 12 of those operators are on the phone at the same time. Now I'm making decisions on my new environment. To me, just running those two reports tells me I either need to staff up or I need to look more towards a contact center where I can start putting some of those calls in a queue. And they're getting the right messaging and they're being handled appropriately, instead of just letting them kind of float out there with a beep in like a native call queuing environment, or a hunt group for that matter, where the call just routes and round robins to multiple hunt groups that are also busy until these people essentially just hang up their calls. So concurrent call volume is a great resource to understand how you want to build that new environment and make the right decisions on what is the licensing that you want to be able to use going forward. Because you could combine this report a lot of different ways with some of the other reports that we've talked about and some of the new reports that we have available.
Okay. Phone registration reports.
Big one. Yep, big one. Again, this one's a little bit less than, it's a little bit less than call data that we've talked about before. This one's not necessarily about, okay, what phones are being used or not used. This report's about a little bit more about, what phones are registered in my environment right now. I may have had a phone that was registered 3 weeks ago, made a couple calls, and it's been unregistered ever since. Well, that may pop up on your underutilization. It's not going to pop up on your dormancy, but you're going to want to know that's taking place. So being able to use the as-built report here to decide what phones are actually registered versus not registered, maybe when the status changed from registered to unregistered, is important when you're building out your new environment, because again, it goes back to not being able to take the garbage to your new house. You want to clean that stuff up, so you want to be able to see what's actually capable of being utilized before you decide whether you want to utilize it.
Okay. Now, Vic, do these reports contain like serial numbers and firmware versions?
So this particular report does not. So we do have some reports that are going to go ahead and give you that exact information. And this is a perfect slide and a great segue, because that's exactly where we're going. Our as-built reports, whether that's your call handlers or your device reports. One of the big things we see, and probably the number 2 report we see besides the dormancy report, is this report, where you're going to be able to go through and look at all the devices in your environment, get the serial numbers, the version numbers, the hardware revisions of all of those devices. Now, everybody that's familiar with Cisco phones knows there's only certain phones that can migrate that are MPP capable, in other words, cloud capable. There's certain versions, certain revisions that they need to be. And from what I understand, there's even some revisions that are supposed to be cloud capable that aren't. It's a different conversation for a different time. But how do you get that information? You got to go look at the box for every phone. You can't pull it out of Call Manager. So our device reports right here are able to actually pull that information out very easily. We actually physically will go out and HTTPS to all the phones to grab that version information and provide a comprehensive list of all of the hard phones within your environment, their versions, their hardware revisions, their firmware, giving you the ability to say, yep, okay, out of the, and this is a true story, out of the 2,000 phones that we have, 800 of them are cloud capable. The rest of them all need to be replaced. So, and that's a true story. I was just working with a customer that's going through an assessment, and that was the first thing they did, is they ran this report to get an idea of how many phones they're going to have to replace. And then they started looking at some of the dormancy and the underutilized to decide whether that actually needs to be a hard phone or whether they could just get away with a WebEx phone on a lot of those.
Jeez. All right. Total call volume reports.
Yep, total call volume. This is one of those reports that is really here to help you understand your pre and post migration. So, one of the things you're going to want to get as you kind of go through your migration and your assessment is an understanding of where we're at now. What does our call volume look like? And that's exactly what this report is. This is a plug and play report. You just run it, throw in your dates and time frames, and it's going to give you basically what your volume is, what your average account, your volume is per day. We use this report for a lot of different reasons, but when we're talking about assessments and migrations, now I've got a pretty static number. I know what my average volume of calls was throughout the last month, 2 months, 3 months, or in this case, almost 5 months. Now, when I start to migrate over to my new location, expect my call volume to be about the same, but how do you know that if you don't have the metrics beforehand? And that's what this report's going to spit out really easily, what your average volumes are, what your total volumes are, because when you move from one to the other, or you start migrating from one to the other, you should see a trend. You should see some things going up, some things going down. And then as you've actually completed your migration or are just about to complete your migration, this is one of those reports you're going to want to run again in your new environment to make sure that your volumes are pretty similar to where they should have been or they were previously. Because just because you move to a new platform doesn't mean you should have 100 million, or 100,000 less calls than you had before. You should have about the same amount of volume. And if you're not getting that, there may be something wrong. And this is a good indication of that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I know we talked about Hunt Group and queue utilization. How are you guys using Department?
So very similar. Yeah, very similar. We see a lot of people utilizing this report to develop their plans. And when we talk about plans, think of like a financial institution is the best way, because I see them using this very heavily. A lot of times they have different branches, and those branches are broken down by device pools. And this is not strictly just financial. We see this in education. We see this in hospitality, where their device pools are helping to define their different regions, their different locations, their different offices, buildings, things like that. Same thing with departments. So as you're deciding how you want to migrate and how you're going to test out these new environments, you want to make sure you're making educated decisions on who to start with. Again, you don't want to just pull a name out of thin air and say, we're going to go ahead and start with, I don't know, home services because we don't think they have very many calls. No, I'm going to start with accounting because I can see they have 184 calls compared to 500. So as we're testing out these things, as we're starting to migrate, we want to make sure we're migrating the right locations, the right departments, the right areas first to test out some of this stuff, instead of just saying, we think it's this one, let's go ahead and try them and see how it works. So this is very good data-driven decision making, and really used for the migration plan, but also extremely strong post-migration, because now you've made that plan, you've carried through with maybe your first location or your first department. But again, going back to that total calls report, you also want to make sure that that volume is where it's supposed to be as you've completed that post-migration. So let's say, I'm getting ready to run a migration. I've migrated my accounting department over. We're getting 184 as total calls for the last, 4 months. I may want to run this report for 2 days or 3 days, and then post-migration, run this report again for my new department and make sure that I'm getting around 184 calls, or I'm getting the same average volume of calls that I was getting before. So great report pre-migration for helping develop that plan, but also post-migration to make sure that what you've migrated is doing what it's supposed to, and you don't have customers just floating around in la-la land.
Okay. All right. So just two more real quick. So this one, I know not a specific report, but multi-platform comparison. What are you guys doing here?
Yep, huge. And this is a lot of what we've talked about throughout this. And this is not just understanding your assessment before the migration, but understanding how that adoption is taking place. You expect to see your Cisco call manager numbers going down, your WebEx call numbers going up. You expect to be able to run a report and see, hey, are my call volumes the same throughout my locations, throughout my hunt groups, throughout my call queues. So, with dashboards, you can see that all in one dashboard. I can run a report and have this for one particular department or location or hunt group. Again, going back to my call volume should pretty much be identical to how it was before. Now, maybe we've made some changes to help improve that. Maybe we've gone to a call queue format, but that doesn't mean that the call volume should change. You expect to see the same types of things, maybe even better, now that you're migrating over to your new location. You've cleaned out some of the garbage, but you need to be able to do that. You can't just say, I hope it's working, because that's not a very educated way to make a decision about your phone systems or how you treat your customers. So we've seen it already where people have done migrations and they've gotten calls that said, this person used to be able to get calls from this queue. They're not getting them anymore. Well, okay, we can see that by running a report and saying, okay, yeah, on this previous phone system, we could see that they were getting calls. On the new system, they're not. This was actually the opposite, though. In this case, in a real life scenario, we ran a report for the old phone system, and we found that this person was not getting calls there either, and they weren't getting calls in the new one. So they actually migrated properly. It's just that the person thought they were supposed to be and said, I think I'm getting less calls. I think I'm supposed to be getting more of these. So it actually did, it was a little bit of awakening for them as they were going through this, because what they discovered is this person was actually supposed to be in a call queue and they weren't. So it actually gave them some insight into something that was actually previously misconfigured. But if they didn't have that, or they didn't have these type of metrics, they would have never saw that. They would have just assumed this person was always in the other hunt group, always getting call volume, always getting call queues. And the fact of the matter is they just weren't.
Interesting. All right. Last one here real quick. So obviously I know we talk about data retention quite a bit, but how are you guys using some of these reports for compliance? And
yeah, there's multiple ways. So now this is a great example of compliance from a call manager perspective, and kind of using even that example I just talked about where, they thought this person was in a call queue. I mean, literally the manager thought they were in this call queue. They used the call data to be like, no, we can see they're never taking calls out of this queue. Well, what they were able to do is actually go back to a snapshot and actually physically look at how the call manager was configured prior to them doing migrations. And they went back to a snapshot from several months ago, and they could see that this particular extension and phone was not part of that call queue. So when we talk about compliance, one, we talk about data retention, call manager data retention, CDR, and how that's necessary. Just because you moved over to WebEx or Teams or Zoom doesn't mean I could just forget I've got 7 years of call manager data that legal might need. That has to be kept. So we can absolutely match that. We can decommission call manager clusters and give you reporting that long-term data retention, whether it's 1 year or 5 years or 10 years, you could keep that running and verify so you're meeting your legal obligations. But also from a call manager perspective, it's great to have this, because when somebody comes back 6 months from now after you've done your cutover and they say, hey, you know what, this isn't working the way that it used to. Well, if your call manager is no longer there, how do you know what used to was? You don't know how it was configured. So being able to use the snapshots and the as-built, I can go back to a call manager snapshot and be like, it was never configured that way. Or, you know what? Oops, it was configured that way, but then we made a conscious decision to change that configuration. But so it's vital from two different aspects. One, the data retention, keeping in compliance with legal, but also keeping that background information to stay compliant with your old system and making sure that those configurations are the same in the new system, but also being able to cover yourself if somebody comes back and says, I don't think it's working the way that it was before. Now you have something to go back to in your old call manager and be like, well, it's programmed the exact same way it was before.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, so those are all the reports I had. Thank you, Vic.
Yeah.
I do see one question. What information can the as-built reports provide on specific sites?
Sure. I mean, I guess it's a bit of a broad question. Once we get into call manager, the easiest way I like to explain that is if you can pull that information out of call manager, you can pull it out of as-built. So if you're looking to see, how your sites are configured or how your route plans are configured, all that can be pulled out of as-built, down to your device pool configurations, your translation pool configuration, or your translation pattern configurations. So essentially, the easiest way I like to explain as-built, if it's in your call manager, you'll be able to pull it out with an as-built report.
All right. So that is, thank you so much for joining us today. That is everything we have for this session. Again, if you are interested in learning more about these migration reports, feel free to reach out to Victor or myself. That's Kevin or Victor at Variphy.com. I'll also drop the migration assessment reports. That's got a sample of all the reports that we talked about and much more. So please feel free to check that out. And we hope to see you next time. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having me.